We're going to pivot a bit and look more present day and discuss the 2020s and a decade of transformation in just a tiny bit. Quick programming note. On the gold stage downstairs, we have in 15 minutes our next panel, which will be a success story, how HealthGrades uses unified data to connect patients with healthcare. So please take note of that. Okay, now on to our current panel. Please welcome Steve Gerber, President and COO Zeta, John Sculley, former Apple CEO, Pepsi President, and co-founder of Zeta, Janet Balis, Partner and CMO Practice Leader at EY, and finally Henry Schuck, Founder and CEO of ZoomInfo. Panelists, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ian. And we should have synchronized because I've got some introductions as well. But it's so great to see everyone and to be here with this esteemed panel. So Henry Schuck, the founder and CEO of ZoomInfo, a disruptor in the B2B space. Janet Balis, partner and CMO practice leader at the global consultancy E&Y, who's been at the forefront of disruptive technologies for more than 20 years. And to my left, John Sculley, who is John Sculley, a legend, former CEO of Apple, PepsiCo, the co-founder of Zeta, and one of the most innovative thinkers in this digital era. So this panel will focus on disruption, specifically disruptive technologies that lead to deep and meaningful change for marketers and marketing. To frame the discussion, we're going to use the rubric of the past, the present, and the future. And we're going to start by zooming out, and it's going to come to a shock to my Zeta colleagues, but I've made some slides. Vladimir, the clicker's not working. There we go. Where's Gary Lee when you need him? So 2007 was a seminal year in the digital economy. Many things happened. So the first, the iPhone was invented and introduced, and with it, the always-on device. Now, Facebook had been around for a couple of years, but 2007 was the first year that they accepted advertising, and that was tied to a persistent ID and led to personalized advertising at scale. Amazon had been in business for a number of years and had started to build an incredible infrastructure. 2007 was actually the year that they had their first third-party customer, the advent of on-demand infrastructure. And of course, 2007 was the year that two innovators had a big idea. And as David said at the outset, we are celebrating Zeta 15. So John, I'll start with you. So few put Zeta in the same category with these other disruptors, Apple, Amazon, Facebook. But in what way were the ideas that you and David had to found Zeta disruptive in marketing and technology?
In 2007, David and I had been friends and partners for about 7 years. We worked together on David's prior company, Infonic. And the thing that we talked about, those examples that Steve just gave us, was that there was going to be a lot of data generated. That would be the derivative effect. And we said, we think there's an opportunity to start to take something which had not really been commercialized in 2007, which was machine learning and AI, and say, when that becomes commercially possible and to be able to take the derivative effect of a lot of data, there's going to be able to build a business at scale. And if you leap ahead to the present time, and we couldn't have anticipated this when we started in 2007, we now see that we have something which is turning out to be really valuable to CMOs. And that is, we can now take the data which our CMO clients have, and we can take the literally billions of digital signals that we have, and we actually transact about several trillion transactions a week with these digital signals. We can now take that data and we can commingle it temporarily and be able to add much greater accuracy to our clients' data by bringing in our data, which is all first-party data coming from our relationship with publishers. And so the ability to come up with things that we could never have anticipated in 2007, but as technologies evolved, gave us a chance to build something which at scale has been pretty good.
Thanks so much, John. And Henry, ZoomInfo is a disruptor in a fairly staid sector. How did some of these disruptive technologies accelerate your rise?
Yeah, I think first, we were also founded in 2007. And for us, when we think about what we were doing at the time was pretty simple. And we sell to businesses that sell to other businesses. And what was a shocking discovery in 2007 is just the fact that if you walked into any business and you asked them, who are your potential customers, who are the people at those companies who make the decisions to buy your products and services, there was no organic place that very simple data just lived inside of a corporation. They didn't know. There were some Excel sheets over here. A couple people thought this. Territories were mapped, but you didn't know who the companies in those territories were. And at the time, there's been a player in the space that was much larger than us. And I think when we thought about disruption, what we thought about, and I think sort of how disruption occurs, is as companies get big, they start focusing on their most profitable customers at the expense of sort of the downstream customers. And if you can find where they're ignoring and start taking advantage of that niche, and then continue to move up and up and up, that is what we did. And what we saw were the competitors were ignoring salespeople. And so our primary user of our product are marketing people and then salespeople. And those salespeople were being ignored, and so we built a product for them, a data product for them, that helped them sell their products and services, and we used that to then expand into other sectors.
Yep, great. And Janet, you've had such a fascinating career because you've been on the side of both sides of disruption, both working at disruptors and advising companies that are sort of disruptees. Can you talk about some of the developments that you've been part of that were caused by some of these disruptive technologies?
Sure. Well, I could tell you lots of stories, but I'll focus on 2007 so we're not here all day. If I focus on that particular year, for me, that was the bookend, actually, of my time at Time Warner. I'd been there for 8.5 years. I spent the first half of that time at Time Inc., so working with the magazines and specifically thinking about how to bring the power of the digital properties across all those magazines. And then the second half was at AOL. And so when I think about 2004 to 2007, the seminal moment for us was actually as we were implementing the technology of DoubleClick. It was actually probably the largest scale implementation, if not the first large scale implementation of DoubleClick that had been done. And so the reason I would highlight that in this particular time frame is it was the first moment where you could move from sort of very bespoke context and content rich solutions that you were sort of manually cobbling together on behalf of advertisers, and a really big shift to audience-based solutions that allowed you to tap in to those data signals, to think about audience-based solutions that were looking at demographics, attitudinal, psychographic targeting at scale for the first time. And I think that pivot is so important because if you think about AOL Time Warner, which is a whole nother story for another day, what was really remarkable was at that moment, it was unlocking the business value to allow us to move from subscriptions to advertising.
Yeah, no, fascinating story, and in that answer is that evolution of advertising from channel to audience to individual. So as we zoom out and close out the look back, John, so much of what the iPhone became started with ideas that you began in the late 80s. And when we think about the adoption of disruptive technology, so much of that is thinking about the consumer side, the demand side, what the adoption curve, crossing the chasm and things like that. You've talked a lot about what that development cycle is on the innovator or the supply side. So how do you think about these long development cycles?
Well, I remember when Steve Jobs left Apple in 1985, Alan Kay, who was one of the most respected people in the high-tech world, he was at Xerox Palo Alto Center and then later Apple as a fellow, he came to me and he said, John, next time we won't have Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center, meaning that Steve Jobs had wisely taken all of the technology that Xerox had invented but had not productized it. And Steve figured out how to productize it, and of course he created the Macintosh from it. And what I learned was that we were going to have to find our innovation from somewhere else. And so Alan Kay was also an adjunct professor at the MIT Media Lab, and he introduced me to the MIT Media Lab. And so much of the technology that we all know today in Apple came from the East Coast, not from the West Coast. And so what's interesting there is that we were one of the early investors in the ARM microprocessor, invented by Herman Hauser at Cambridge University. And this was the first low-powered microprocessor. But to commercialize it, it needed an operating system. So we set up a team at 1 Kendall Square in Cambridge, and we wrote the first operating system for the ARM processor. We owned 43% of the ARM processor in those days. We wrote all the development tools for it, and we used it initially for Newton. Newton was way before its time, but all of that work ended up going into the iPhone. The other interesting thing is that Alan Kay took me around to see what innovations were going on in labs that we could get into. And one of the things we found was that there was so many things that were going to be predictive of what would be possible in about 20 years as Moore's law enabled things to get, doubling in performance every couple of years. And so I wrote a book and I described something called the Knowledge Navigator, which was going to be a prototype product for this. I went to George Lucas and said, George, we can't make this product, but is there a way to simulate it with special effects? And we did that. We created a concept video and we took it all over the world. And if you go to Google and look up Knowledge Navigator 1987, you will see the Knowledge Navigator. But it won't look very unique to you, because it looks exactly like an iPad that came out 20 years later.
Yeah, just incredible. So I think that story really encapsulates. So you could put a man on the moon, but here's the slide. So this quote by Bill Gates, probably the only famous Bill Gates quote, is we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10 or 20, as John indicated. So the change that really encapsulates this is the change in consumer behavior. So mobile really has been the ultimate disruptor, and as you look at time spent by consumers, this leads to the rise of what we at Zeta call the connected consumer. A new type of user who is always on, filtering and judging and sharing and buying. And it's changed the game for marketing. It's made legacy enterprises have to catch up. It's also led to the creation of new entrants, as you think about things like DTC or all of the new brands that have come to scale over the last 10 years. So let's start with Janet. You primarily advise what we would call incumbent enterprises today. What are the types of challenges that you're helping CMOs with today in terms of breaking through and connecting with the connected consumer and accelerating their digital transformation?
Sure. By the way, I think that chart is kind of interesting because the dichotomy there is television versus mobile, and we could actually just put video and maybe it would actually just be an ascending line, or it would look like a very different curve. I think the challenge we have is that consumers lead us and that we're always in catch-up mode because we as businesses have to follow. So the hardest thing is keeping up with this connected consumer. I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room about the fragmentation of consumer behavior across screens, or the incredible challenges that we have from an interoperability standpoint that, certainly we've had around measurement and attribution, around things like connecting linear and digital in meaningful ways that allowed us to fluidly just follow the consumer where they are. And I think very meaningfully, if we look at some of the logos that were on the prior screens, the ability to think seamlessly between many of the closed ecosystems and the open ecosystems. For a marketer, they just want to find their consumer and they want to drive outcomes. I think where our transformation focus is right now is that the innovation only continues on the business side to unlock new value with all that new behavior. So for example, right now there's an explosion of new capability and opportunities in the retail media network space, which I think are particularly interesting, that bring us very close to where that purchase really happens. And I think that we're trying to help clients not think about a false dichotomy between brand advertising and performance advertising, and simply allocating between top of funnel and bottom funnel, but really meaningfully connect the full funnel all the way through. And that's really hard work to be able to see that objectively and really optimize it, because at the end of the day, all marketers care about at any stage of the funnel is driving outcomes and business results.
Absolutely, and that's also the rise of the modern CMO. So back to you, Henry. You're an example not only of a disruptor, but also a digital-first company. And you've played in a sector that's been fairly staid. It also had a macro shock or disruption with COVID that upended a lot of traditional B2B sales and marketing. How much of those changes were driven by this connected consumer, or we'll call it the connected user in your case, and how many of those changes do you think are here to stay?
Yeah, I think what we saw during COVID was this like kind of historical way of selling or marketing your products for most businesses who sell to other businesses was mainly offline. And so there were a lot of events, there were a lot of outings, there was a lot of Rolodex leveraging. And when COVID happened, you saw a lot of these businesses wake up and say, wait a second, I probably should have already been doing this, and now I must do it. And so we saw a much higher level of adoption of digital-first technologies to go to market. I think the other thing that I think about a lot from a disruption perspective is usually when we hear disruption, our mind goes to product. And you can get disrupted in lots of different ways. Product is one way. Go to market is another way. We're all here because we're marketers. Marketing is another way. You can disrupt big companies in your space through a lot of different avenues or channels. And I see it all the time where, I'm paying attention not just to the way that our product sells and the way that we build our product, but also the way we go to market. And is there an opportunity for a new company to make it easier to buy products and services that go to market in a more efficient way that can disrupt through that channel? So I think it makes sense to think about disruption across multiple channels because it doesn't always just come in the form of product.
That's a great point. And so as we think ahead or look ahead, the ultimate impact of disruption is not behavioral, it's economic. And so when you think about those 2007 innovations, again, the size, scope, and value of the mobile economy is stunning. And this is revenue. This is not market cap, which would probably make it the same size as the US. But it's about $1 trillion economy, about the size of the Netherlands. It would be the 19th largest economy in the world. So, John, as we think about this and going back 100 years to the Industrial Revolution, the only thing that is something like this that creates an ecosystem is the automobile. So as we look ahead 10 or 20 years, what are some of the technologies today that, whether it's robotics or AI or wearables or space, that you think has the potential to have a disruption like this and create $1 trillion economy?
Well, let's take some examples that are in the news pretty currently. Mark Zuckerberg says he's going to spend $60 billion on research and development on the metaverse. And people talk about metaverse, Web 3.0, and all these different things. It's like it's one big soup you stir up. I don't see it that way at all. I think the metaverse is incredibly challenging technical hurdles to get through. An example is that when you look at a field of view that's not 16:9 like a television screen, but it's 180 degrees, and when you have something like goggles on your eyes, I don't know if you tried an Oculus, which is an amazing product, but try wearing it for more than 15 minutes without getting a headache. The point is you need much higher resolution, you need many more pixels for 180 degrees, you need batteries that don't exist to be able to do that, you need screens that don't exist, and so my guess is it will eventually happen, but it's probably going to be in the game industry because the game industry is where virtual reality makes the most sense. And by the way, the game industry is just booming in growth now. You see all the M&A that's going on. So I focus more on what's happening with augmented reality. And we keep hearing about different companies that are going to come out with glasses next year. The way I think about the glasses, they will come out, whether it's next year or soon after, is that you've got to look at it the same way Apple's always looked at hardware, which is it has to be beautiful design. And in this case, the glasses, in my opinion, need to be all about new material science, about beautiful fashion, that when people put it on, it's like putting sunglasses on, but obviously you don't want sunglasses on, in the nighttime or inside a room. So it's going to be a screen that you may look at in one eye, that you'll see very high resolution, things that are being generated. But on the other hand, if you look at a person with these glasses on, they won't look like kind of a freak, but they'll be looking like they have really beautiful fashion lenses on. So I do think the augmented reality in glasses will happen definitely in this decade. I think metaverse is probably a little bit further out.
Thanks, John. And as we move to our last few minutes here, I think it's important for the CMOs and marketing practitioners here to zoom out and realize that disruption is not just technology, it's also things like, or forces such as war and inflation that have really changed how we're planning for 2023 and the near term. Janet, why don't we start with you in terms of how CMOs are thinking about the economy and thinking about these digital transformation investments when they're under pressure in the boardroom?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that most CMOs are probably worried about their CFOs. And the reason is because what we really need to acknowledge is that a CMO really wants to make sure that the work that they're doing is understood by their CFO in a moment like this. Because when you're sitting in a moment where you are facing markets with a tremendous amount of volatility, when every headline talks about supply chain issues and inflation issues, it introduces the immediate thought that obviously there's a lot of economic uncertainty, and so the first thought is, what's discretionary and what could be cut, and what do all of us think as marketers? Are we going to be, a target of those cuts? So what's interesting to me is I think most CMOs are being very smart about this, and I think the first thing they're looking at is what happened during the last economic downturn. For any company that has a long-term relationship with their customer or their consumer, they know that it was incredibly hard if they cut too much to build back those relationships. So being very careful not to overcut or cut at all and spend into the downturn, I think, is one of the things that a lot of CMOs are talking about. I think the other thing is that when you think about how much media and digital media has moved to programmatic marketplaces and auction-based ideas, there's also a lot of opportunity when people pull out of a marketplace to actually spend more effectively and efficiently. So I think you also see people saying, why should I pull back? I want to lean in. For certain consumable categories, there's no reason to pull back either. That being said, there are certain discretionary sectors that will act very differently and have to be very judicious. Across the board, I would say there is a continued and very focused effort on how to be extremely agile in marketing, not just in development, but really to think about how do you think about audience, channel, creative, use of data to make sure that effectiveness and efficiency are maximized no matter what the spend level is.
Absolutely, the primacy of ROI. So Henry, other than spending more with ZoomInfo, what advice would you give to CMOs about investing during times of uncertainty.
Spend more with Zeta too. Thank you. I should just leave.
And thank you, everyone.
I think Janet's point around, I think what she's really getting at is trust. And the CFO needs to have trust with their CMO. And I think one of the things in the B2B world that marketers really struggle with is attribution. And being able to tie marketing spend to attributed revenue is hard. I think there are all sorts of technologies that are trying to make this easier and different ways that you can try to get at this. But I think first and foremost, marketers have to build trust with their CFO counterparts to get them to understand where investment is performance-based and you can see an outcome. Once you can tie that outcome together and you can start building trust, you gain the trust to do things that are more difficult to attribute revenue to, but you built trust around the work that you do and it gives you that latitude to do it. So I just think really being able to tie the efforts that you're doing back to a revenue line and attribution is critically important for marketers.
Absolutely. Investment and activity tied to achievement and outcomes is so critical. So John, zooming out a bit from your perspective, you've been through many business cycles and you talk to not just CMOs, but also CEOs, chairmen of boards, CFOs. What's your advice to them during times like this?
Well, my advice is that there's pretty good evidence through many different business cycles that the cost of replacing a lost customer, regardless of what industry you're in, to replace the lost profit of a lost customer is about 20 times more expensive than to go out and hold on to that customer in the first place. So if I were a CMO, I'd be looking at my most valuable customers, you know, the ones who actually generate profits, and make sure that I don't lose them during the recession, because recessions don't last a long time. You know, there's more discussion before the recession of when is the recession going to start, but if we have a recession, it's probably going to be over, you know, sometime next year. So I would say focus on retaining your most important customers.
It's great advice. And as we are closing this out, we're taking a quote from Alan Kay, who we talked about before, one of the great innovators of Silicon Valley and of this digital era. And we have the gift of sitting with his frequent collaborator and partner in John Sculley. So for this group that is looking at short-term headwinds but wants to use disruption as a tailwind in 23 and beyond, what's one piece of advice that they should take away from this panel?
I say the operative words for me would be category design. Think about during the pandemic, the industries that took off, telehealth, you know, Zoom videos, you know, and it was just explosive. And yet, both those industries are challenged now in terms of, so now what do? What does Peloton do after all of its success during the pandemic? So if you can create a category and be the owner and the leader of creating that category, that's the best position you can possibly be in marketing. And I'd say that if you're not the creator, then think about how you can redesign a category that leverages the thing that you're going to be particularly known for.
Thank you so much, John, Janet, Henry, and thank you to the audience for such a wonderful panel and what great words for everybody here to get better tomorrow, next year, and 10 years from now. Thank you.